In doubt, turn left. We've all been there, right? You ask someone for the directions and they tell you something like, oh, it's the first turn after the old Sherman place. You can't miss it. And of course, you do.
I almost changed it anyway.
The old Sherman place was torn down years ago and is now a 7-Eleven. Knowing where you are or where you're going is sometimes a tricky business. History is often helpful in this regard. None of us are just plopped down in our lives. We came from somewhere, and that somewhere is important to where we are now and most likely to where we're going. Our own personal stories are one thing, but to be a movement, a religion withal, we have to be more than a collection of personal stories. We need a tradition, a grand story, a narrative, one that we can learn about and experience and work from in the life we share together. And guess what? We have one, but we don't use it very well because, as Philip Hewitt points out, we take too much notice of the landmark lives of famous Unitarian Universalists and too little notice of the flow of history that lifted those individuals up. Speaking of landmarks, here's a story. Once upon a time, a long time ago, after twice repeating the rather complicated directions to some destination or another, one dear friend of mine took a moment, looked into my face, and realized that I was already hopelessly lost. Was it the blue house with the black shutters on my right, where I was supposed to take a left? Or was it the blue house on my left, where I was supposed to take a right? Sensing my confusion, this kindly person let me out of my bewilderment by offering a simple rule of thumb. When in doubt, turn left. My friend had taken everything she knew about my confusion and the vagaries of this particular route, all the zigs and zags, forks and intersections, and summed them up in this sort of conceptual roadmap. When in doubt, turn left. Did it leave open the possibility that I would, in false confidence, careen off in the wrong direction? Sure, but I wasn't confident about anything. I barely knew where I was. She was using my uncertainty as a compass. Apparently, it worked. I eventually got where I was headed. At least I'm not driving around in the backwoods of Maine anymore. So the injunction, when in doubt, turn left, has for me become something of a watchword, a way out of uncertainty. It comes in handy in knowing how and when to evaluate doubt, how to notice when just barging in on in error might not be the right thing to do. It also comes in handy these days for finding one's way through political discussions. When in doubt, turn left. But more seriously, this watchword is a handy way to track the history of religions, especially Unitarian Universalism, and it is that consistent, radicalizing leftward drift in our own religious path that I would like to explore with you this morning. It begins with doubt. You know the feeling. Something doesn't add up. You might even get a queasy feeling in your stomach, sweat a little. You realize there's something fundamentally wrong. Your face takes on that wincing expression. You know, that sort of wincing expression. Really? You ask yourself? That doesn't seem right. What you are feeling at that moment is anxiety. Doubt produces anxiety. You have two choices. You can double down on your anxiety and become an extremist, striking out at those who are causing your misery in hatred or anger, or you can turn left and become a radical. Find another set of facts, below, beneath, behind the present circumstances, and work from those new suppositions. The word radical comes from radix, the Latin word for roots. My thesis this morning is that Unitarianism in particular and Universalism in its own time made the choice over and over again to avoid obvious extreme positions and rather used the capacity for rational thought to get under and behind the surface of popular opinion, to turn left into the area of radical religious thought, whatever that meant at the time. I'm going to offer two examples and a conclusion. The first example involves some little-known history of the sort we like to think we can leave behind, but which has shaped us in ways that we tend to take for granted. The source for this is a little book by the aforementioned Philip Hewitt called Rakowia. It's right here, which title refers to a small town in 16th century Poland, of all places, known as Raków. Raków, for more than 2 generations in the tumultuous 16th century, was the Unitarian capital of Europe. A quick survey here. You will recall that Martin Luther kicked off what has become known as the Protestant Reformation in Germany in something like 1520. But he was a late comer. Scholarship had already blown the lid off things by translating the lost works of the classical period, of Greeks and the Romans, into contemporary languages, Italian, French, German. Luther himself translated the New Testament into German for the first time. The upshot was that the Catholic Church began to lose its grip on truth, on its narrative, on its own tradition. Science and art and literature developed new truths and new traditions. Of course, the Church fought back, and whole populations fled the Inquisition and unfriendly courts from one country to another, from Italy to Switzerland to Czechoslovakia to Transylvania, where the king himself was sheltered dissidents, to Poland, where our story takes place, and then on to the Netherlands, and finally to England, over a period of about 150 years. The Reformation was probably finished by the middle of the 17th century, succeeded by the Enlightenment. End of survey. We tend to think you all get A's. We tend to think of the Reformation as a Western European thing, notably French and German and English, but much of the action happened much further east, necessarily in Poland, which, except for Russia, was the largest country in Europe at the time. But it was also ruled by an unusually enlightened and tolerant government, turning left for Unitarian Unitarian thinkers and teachers in the 16th century, as one safe haven after another collapsed behind them, meant getting on the road to Poland, often heading for a little town called Raków. Raków had been settled in mid-century by members of what was known as the Church of the Polish Brethren, or the Minor Reformed Church of Poland. There, under the protection of the sympathetic noblemen, the Brethren built a church, a university, and a publishing house. Living in community along with Moravians and Mennonites and Hutterites and other Anabaptist groups, this area became the anchor for what we now recognize as the left wing of the Protestant Reformation. The pinnacle of 16th century Unitarian theological thought that would develop into American Universal Unitarianism was written in Raków and was called the Rakovian Catechism. With apologies, here are some of its tenets. It affirmed the unity of God as opposed to the triune expression of the Catholic Church. It repudiated the doctrine of original sin. Baptism, therefore, was as a washing away of sin, was therefore unwarranted. Jesus had a prophetic role in revealing the will of God, but his death was not to be taken as atonement for sins. God frequently and freely forgives sinners who choose to truly repent as an act of their own free will. Jesus is not God. He is a holy man, person. Communion is a common meal in which we acknowledge our discipleship. It's nourishment, like real food, not a sacrament. The church is not an institution, but exists wherever these truths are accepted and expounded in one heart, in nature, or in community. No institution, another one, was no institution may exercise control over the individual. Only Scripture, as one understands it oneself, has that authority. And written as a series of questions and answers and organized into topic chapters, the Rakovian Catechism forms the underpinnings of modern Unitarian Universalism. If you want to read it, it's right here. It's a facsimile of a 19th century translation. Eventually, in trying to find out how their little community fit into the colossus of the state, the Unitarians in Rakov would promote complete separation of church and state. And within the coils of religious conflict that characterized their period, the Unitarians of Rakov held to strict pacifism. Strict pacifism. In fact, Hewitt relates how Unitarians at court wore decorative wooden swords, the fashion of the day, not metal ones that could kill someone. Before too long, the Unitarian community of Rakov got plowed under by the Counter-Reformation, and by the early 17th century, the church and the university, and especially the publishing house, were no more. Unitarianism fled helter-skelter to Transylvania and to the Netherlands and eventually to England. The Rakovian Catechism itself was presented as a gift to James I and VI of England, he of the King James Gospel, who ordered all copies of it to be burned at the stake. In the 1650s somewhere, Parliament declared the Catechism to be heretical, which only proves that it had escaped the flames. Today, we ignore it. Hewitt develops an argument that we cannot today ignore, however. He writes, "It was in Rakov that the tension between individuality and community was wrestled with in a form that challenged successive generations. It was there that the issue of participation or non-participation in a social order of which one could not morally approve was debated. It was there that questions of tolerance and inclusiveness, both in religious institutions and in society at large, found memorable expression. It was there that change and growth in theological, ethical, and political thinking were promoted. These themes are lively ones to this day." The questions of tolerance and inclusiveness form the basis for my second example of Unitarian Universalism's leftward turn away from extremism and toward radicalism. I'll be brief. We are all familiar with the problem of American racism. We have fought with it in our congregations and on the streets for as long as there have been Unitarians in this country. Unitarians embraced the end of the slave trade in the 18th century, fought for the abolition of slavery in the 19th century, marched and died for African American civil rights in the 20th century, each time pushing the conversation to the left, advocating for radical but not extreme responses to intolerable conditions. Now, in the 21st century, we are moving again, declaring as a white movement, that Black Lives Matter, putting our privilege finally on the line. We weren't just plopped down in the middle of these times, in the middle of these situations. We came from somewhere, and that somewhere is important to where we are now, and most likely to where we're going. In conclusion, I want to pick up one other thread from Hewitt. The tension he underlines between the individual and the community. I've lived a long time. When I was raising daughters in the midst of the early 80s, the watchword was free to be you and me. Free to be you and me. Remember that? It celebrated individualism and personal expression as high values. It was great for raising girls. But now we're moving on, turning left again, in declaring that Black Lives Matter. Not only are we participating in a ferment that we have been promoting for centuries, we are declaring that even though once upon a time we prized individuality and personal growth and development, today we are saying as a movement that until Black Lives Matter, our own personal growth and development remains in jeopardy, stunted and unfulfilled. That, my friends, is a landmark turn to the left, a radical development, a turn from individuality to community. None of us are free till all of us are free. May it be so.